Hello and welcome to Lecture 4C. This is our final lecture in the three-part series of Lecture 4. Today we're talking about parallel structure and verb tense. So parallel structure is also referred to as parallelism or parallel construction in the sources that I've linked to. This is another element that helps us maintain coherence. So it helps our paragraphs stick together, it helps them remain similar, and it helps the reader reduce the amount of information they have to keep track of in order to understand what's being said. So this applies to verbs, phrases, and clauses. In other words, if we have multiple verbs within a paragraph, we'd like to keep them in the similar tense, or phrases, we'd like to have similar types of wording, and clauses. I'll show some examples of each of those. There are a few places where parallel structure really comes into play. The first is in lists. And that can be a list that is inside of a paragraph, or a bullet list, or a numbered list. We want those to have the identical structure. The second is before and after conjunctions, so coordinating conjunctions like and, but, for, or so. So we have some words before the and we have some words after the end, and we try and keep the phrasing similar before and after. And again, I'll show some examples of this. So let's have a look. So here is an example of a list on the left that does not have parallel structure. And you'll probably hear that it doesn't sound great when I read it. This grant proposal highlights the benefits of this study to society, including increased water supply, improving our understanding in the aquifer. It will help find remediation solutions, contributes to world peace. So we understand what that means. It's really not that hard to understand. But we know that we can say this in a way that sounds better by putting all of these verbs into the same tense. So I'll just read the bullet points again. I won't read the paragraph over and over, but in the first sense, I've got increasing water supply, improving our understanding, helping to find remediation solutions, contributing to world peace. And in the final box on the right, I've got the same list, but now just put them all into past tense because this is something we hope to achieve by the end. So we'll have increased water supply, improved understanding, and identified remediation solutions, and enhanced world peace. All of these are in the same verb tense. On slide 4, we've got parallel structure with coordinating conjunctions. And here I've used two examples, written them in a few different ways. So on the left, this is a sentence with a coordinating conjunction. In this case, we have and the bottom sentence is another coordinating conjunction. We have because. So I'll go through these one at a time. The study focuses on the shallow aquifer near Mill Creek, and it will identify any sources of pollutants. So in this case, we have focuses, which is in the present tense, and will identify in the future tense. This actually doesn't sound all that bad, but it is a little bit better if we put them both either in the future tense, as I've got in the middle, or the present tense, as I have on the right. And I actually don't like the one on the right that much. I had to add aims to identify because identify by itself didn't make that much sense. So sometimes we have to pick and choose, and in some cases we might be stuck not using parallel structure, but in most cases we can find a tense that will work for everything. So on the bottom one, historically the aquifer has been overlooked because it is not visible to policymakers. So it has been overlooked because it is not visible. Sounds okay, but it actually doesn't make that much sense. What the present state of the aquifer is not always relevant to what happened in the past. So what is actually more directly relevant was that it had not been visible at that time, and therefore it had been overlooked. So the aquifer has been overlooked because it has not been visible to policymakers. The sentence on the right is also in the past tense. Historically, the aquifer was overlooked because it was not visible to policymakers. This is actually a little bit shorter. Either of these is probably okay. This next list deals with infinitives. The main tasks of the study are to drill wells, we will measure water levels, and sample for chemistry. This sounds a lot better if we just say, the main tasks of the study are to drill wells, to measure water levels, and to sample for chemistry. Even though this might be a little bit repetitive, it is just much easier to digest this type of language. The objectives of drilling are to install wells, collect soil samples, and the aquifer will be characterized. This is much better if we say the objectives of drilling are to install wells, to collect soil samples, and to characterize the aquifer. Again, it might be a little bit repetitive, but it's much easier to read. So going beyond parallel structure, which really applies within a paragraph or within a list or within some parcel of words, we would like to have consistency, particularly in our verb usage, throughout an entire document. Now, this is often not possible because, as I show in the lower half of this slide, different parts of the document will deal with different types of information. So if that's not possible, then it's still best to have consistency within a section, within a paragraph, and within a given sentence. So in a typical scientific document, we'll have an introduction. The introduction will describe the state of what is, the state of what is known. It might describe some historical aspects, in which case we need the past tense. It might describe what has been found in the literature, other studies that have been done, in which case we need the past tense for those. And in fact, when we're describing a literature review within an introduction, it's best to have a subsection, and that way that entire subsection can remain consistent with regards to its verbs. The next sections in a typical scientific report are the methods, results, and discussion. And these almost always describe something from the past. It's quite straightforward to describe our methods section in the past tense. Sometimes people will describe the results and discussion in the present tense. In other words, the results are this, the results are that. In my opinion, it's better to describe these in the past. The results were found at a certain time. Although the results may still be valid, it's just more straightforward to understand what the results were at the time those results were found. And then when it comes to the conclusions, we might actually talk about the past, present, or the future. We might conclude something about the past in terms of what we've learned. And I'll probably repeat this about 20 times this term, but the conclusion section should not just be some repetition of what has already been said throughout the document. The conclusion section should be something new that you've learned as a result of your discussion and your methods and your results and your introduction. So the conclusion should be new, hopefully something fairly insightful, a big picture takeaway message. So this can be in the past, it can refer to the present state, and it can also talk about the future, because often in a conclusion section, we might want to talk about what are the next steps in this field of study. So let's look at a few paragraphs where consistent verb tense has not been applied. The samples are collected from an outcrop near the highway. The highway runs north-south along the lake. Samples are ground into fine powder for analysis in the lab. They were ground up until all particles are smaller than 10 micrometers in diameter. We then analyzed the samples at the EESC laboratory at UBCO. Samples will be stored in a cooler in case further analysis is required. This is a fairly typical first draft of what somebody might write, and it can be made into a nice consistent verb tense by changing each verb into the past tense, as I've done on the right. So the samples were collected from an outcrop near the highway. The highway ran north-south along the lake. Samples were ground into fine powder for analysis in the lab. They were ground up until all particles were smaller than 10 micrometers in diameter. We then analyzed the samples at the EESC laboratory at UBCO. Samples were stored in a cooler in case further analysis was required. And I'll just comment on a few things here. Number one is, clearly I should have used a non-breaking space between 10 and micrometers on the right. But more importantly, I'm going to comment on ran in the first paragraph. The highway ran north-south along the lake. Now that might sound a little strange. We could also just say it runs. But at the time that we sampled, the highway did run north-south. Although it also sounds a little bit odd, we don't know for an absolute fact that by the time somebody is reading this, that highway will still run north-south. So the past is actually preferred because that is what we saw, that is what we observed at the time of our study. So this is consistent verb tense. Let's take consistent verb tense one step further and talk about active versus passive verb tense. So in the active voice, the subject does the action, whereas in the passive voice, the subject is acted upon by somebody or something doing an action, and often that somebody or something is unstated. So in the active voice, I analyzed the sample. In the passive voice, the sample was analyzed, probably by somebody, maybe by me, who knows. The active voice is preferred over the passive voice. It is precise, it is concise, it is compelling, and it is unambiguous. In other words, we know exactly who did what. It is clear, it's usually shorter to state it that way, and it leaves nothing unsaid. Now, there are a few circumstances where the passive voice might be acceptable or even necessary. So if we don't know who did something, it's often necessary to use the passive voice. And there are also times where we just want to talk about the subject matter, and introducing the person or the thing that did the action might just be a distraction. So in general, try and stick to the active voice, but don't feel like this is a hard and fast rule that you absolutely have to avoid the passive voice. Because sometimes when we have something that's in the passive voice, if we try too hard to put it into the active voice, it can come out nonsensical as we try and skirt around the actor when we don't know who the actor was. So I'm going to resume with the same paragraphs that we discussed earlier. Now on the left, we see the paragraph that I had corrected earlier by putting all into the same verb tense, but now let's correct it again to put it all into the active voice. So now instead of the samples were collected, we say we collected samples. Instead of samples were ground, we ground. Now I still wrote the highway ran because the highway ran was an active voice the first time. And now instead of the second sentence in the second paragraph, I've just put this parenthetically because we don't need a second sentence for that. So now I've just tried to make it a little bit more concise. And then in the final paragraph, we then analyzed that is still in the active voice. We stored samples. This might sound a little bit strange for a scientific paper, but I think consistency is preferred here. So we stored samples in a cooler in case further analysis was required. So in case further analysis was required remains in the passive voice. I couldn't think of a very good way to put that into active voice. And so like I say, it's not a hard, fast rule where passive voice is automatically incorrect. Sometimes it makes sense to leave it in the passive voice. And that's actually it for this lecture. This is a fairly short lecture. There is quite a bit of reading to do on the active versus passive voice and parallel construction in the links provided. So please go read those examples and have a look at the different ways of looking at parallel construction and active and passive voice. Okay, see you next week.